The winter of 1847 came early to the Colorado Territory, bringing with it the kind of cold that could kill a man in hours if he wasn't careful. Thomas Hartwell had lived alone on his ranch for 3 years now, ever since his wife Sarah had passed from fever during their first winter in the territory. At 32 years old, he had accepted his solitude as permanent, focusing his energy on building his cattle operation and surviving the harsh mountain winters. That December morning started like any other. Thomas woke before dawn, pulled on his heavy wool coat, and trudged through knee-deep snow to check on his cattle. The storm the night before had been fierce, and he needed to make sure none of his herd had wandered too far or gotten trapped in snowdrifts. He saddled his horse, a sturdy bay mare named Copper, who had proven herself reliable in the worst conditions, and rode out toward the eastern pasture where the cattle liked to shelter among the pine trees. The sky was clear now, painted in shades of pink and orange as the sun crept over the mountain peaks. The beauty of it still took his breath away, even after all these years. Thomas was about 2 miles from his cabin when Copper suddenly stopped and refused to move forward. He knew better than to ignore his horse's instincts. Scanning the white landscape, he saw nothing at first, just endless snow and the dark shapes of evergreen trees. Then a splash of color caught his eye, something dark against the pristine white about 50 yards to his left. He urged Copper forward carefully, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle strapped to his saddle. As he got closer, his heart nearly stopped. 2 figures lay huddled together in the snow, wrapped in what looked like buffalo hide blankets that were woefully inadequate for the freezing temperatures. Thomas jumped from his horse and ran toward them, his boots sinking deep with each step. When he reached the figures, he found 2 young women, clearly Native American, their faces pale and their lips tinged with blue. They were alive, but barely, their breathing shallow and their skin cold to the touch. He didn't hesitate. Thomas gathered the smaller of the 2 women in his arms first, carrying her to Copper and draping her across the saddle. Then he went back for the second woman, who was slightly taller and heavier, but still light enough for him to carry. He knew he couldn't ride with both of them, so he grabbed Copper's reins and began the long walk back to his cabin, moving as fast as the deep snow would allow. By the time he reached home, his muscles burned and his lungs ached from the cold air, but he didn't stop. He carried both women inside, laying them on the floor near the fireplace, which had burned down to embers. He quickly added logs and kindling, coaxing the fire back to life until it roared with heat. Thomas knew that warming them too quickly could be dangerous, so he worked carefully, removing their wet outer garments and wrapping them in dry wool blankets. He heated water and made tea, lifting their heads gently to drip the warm liquid between their cracked lips. He rubbed their hands and feet slowly, trying to restore circulation without causing damage. Hours passed. Thomas maintained his vigil, keeping the fire burning hot and checking their breathing regularly. As evening fell, the smaller woman began to stir. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and confused, and she immediately tried to sit up, looking around frantically. Thomas held up his hands in a gesture of peace. He spoke slowly, knowing she might not understand English. "You're safe. I found you in the snow. Your sister is here too. She's alive." The woman's eyes found her companion, and some of the tension left her body. She said something in a language Thomas didn't understand, her voice hoarse and weak. "Water," Thomas said, offering her a cup. "Drink." She accepted it cautiously, watching him over the rim as she drank. When she finished, she pointed to herself and said, "Ilu." Then she pointed to her sister, "Kaya." Thomas nodded and touched his own chest. "Thomas." Over the next few days, both sisters recovered from their ordeal. Kaya woke the following morning, and though she was weaker than Ilu, she improved steadily with food and warmth. Thomas learned through a combination of gestures, drawings, and the few English words the sisters knew that they were Apache, separated from their tribe during a raid by another group. They had wandered for days in the snow, trying to find their way back, before the cold had finally overcome them. Thomas gave them his bedroom and slept on a pallet by the fire, insisting despite their protests that they needed proper rest to recover fully. He cooked for them, sharing his stores of dried meat, beans, and the vegetables he had preserved from his summer garden. He gave them clothes that had belonged to Sarah, which he had never been able to bring himself to throw away. As the days turned into weeks, an unusual household developed on Thomas's remote ranch. Elu, who proved to be the elder sister at 23 years old, was practical and hard-working. She took over much of the cooking, adapting Thomas's provisions into dishes that were far more flavorful than anything he had managed on his own. Kaya, just 20, was quieter but equally helpful, with a gift for working with animals that amazed Thomas. His horses, usually skittish around strangers, calmed immediately under her touch. The sisters discussed their situation in their own language. Conversations Thomas couldn't understand but could guess at. They had no way of finding their tribe, which moved constantly through the territory. Winter made travel impossible anyway. And Thomas Hartwell, this strange, quiet man who had saved their lives without asking for anything in return, had proven himself kind and honorable. In Apache culture, such a life debt was not taken lightly. By February, a routine had established itself. Thomas worked outside with the cattle, Elu managed the household, and Kaya helped with both, moving between them with natural grace. In the evenings, they sat together by the fire, teaching each other words in their respective languages. Thomas learned that Elu meant beautiful, and Kaya meant elder sister, which confused him until they explained that Kaya had been named for a beloved aunt who had died. He found himself looking forward to these evening conversations, more than he wanted to admit. After 3 years of silence, having voices in his home again felt like coming back to life after a long illness. One evening in late February, Elu approached him with unusual formality. Kaya stood beside her, both of them dressed in their finest clothing, combinations of Apache garments they had made from materials Thomas had provided. "Thomas," Elu said carefully, her English much improved after weeks of practice, "we must speak." He set aside the harness he had been mending and gave them his full attention. "You save our lives," Elu continued. "In our way, this means much. We owe great debt." Thomas shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Kaya spoke up, her voice soft but firm. "Not anyone. Many would leave us. Many would hurt us. You are good man." Elu nodded. "We have no tribe now, no family. Winter is long, spring is far. But even when spring comes—" She paused, gathering her words. "We wish to stay." Thomas felt his heart beat faster, though he tried to keep his expression neutral. "You're welcome to stay as long as you like. There's plenty of room, plenty of work." The sisters exchanged a glance, seeming to communicate in that silent way they had. Then Elu took a deep breath. "We wish to stay as wives," she said. "Both of us. To be your family." Thomas stared at them, certain he had misunderstood. "Both of you." Kaya stepped forward and took one of his hands while Elu took the other. "In our way," Kaya explained, "this is not strange. A good man, a strong man. He may have more than one wife. Sisters especially may share husband. We take care of each other, take care of him. It is good way." Thomas's mind raced. He thought of Sarah, of the love he had felt for her and the grief that had consumed him after her death. He had never imagined marrying again, let alone taking 2 wives at once. The idea went against everything he had been raised to believe was proper. But looking at these 2 women, who had come into his life through the strangest of circumstances, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope, possibility, the stirring of affection that had been growing slowly all winter, which he had refused to acknowledge because acknowledging it meant facing the loneliness he had worked so hard to bury. "This is not the custom where I come from," he said slowly. "We know," Elu replied, "but we are not from where you come, and you are not living in where you come from. You are here in the mountains, where no one sees, no one judges." Here there is only us and the land and what we choose to make of our lives." Thomas looked at their faces, so different, and yet both so earnest. Elu with her practical determination, Kaya with her gentle spirit. They had brought light back into his dark cabin and warmth back into his frozen heart. "I need time to think," he said finally. They nodded, releasing his hands. "We understand," Elu said. "We wait." Thomas spent the next week in a state of profound confusion. He worked harder than ever, trying to exhaust his body so his mind would quiet. It didn't work. Every evening, sitting across from Elu and Kaya, he found himself imagining what it would be like to truly have them as partners, as family. He thought about the practicalities. Life on the frontier was hard, especially for women. Having two of them to share the work and support each other made a certain kind of sense. He thought about the loneliness that had been his constant companion for 3 years, and how it had lifted since the sisters arrived. He thought about growing old alone, dying alone, being found frozen in the snow like he had found them. On the 8th day, he made his decision. That evening, when the sisters sat down for dinner, Thomas cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about what you proposed," he said. Both women went still, their eyes fixed on him. "Where I come from, what you're suggesting would be considered wrong, sinful even." He saw their faces begin to fall and hurried to continue. "But I've been thinking about what Elu said. I'm not living where I came from anymore. I'm here, and here with you, I've been happier than I've been in years." He stood and walked around the table to stand before them. "I don't know if I can be a good husband to one woman, let alone two, but if you're willing to take that chance, so am I." The smiles that broke across their faces made his heart swell. Elu reached for him first, pulling him into an embrace, and then Kaya joined them, the three of them holding each other in the warm cabin while the snow fell silently outside. They were married that spring in a ceremony that combined Apache traditions with the simple vows Thomas remembered from his parents' church back east. There was no preacher to officiate, no guests to witness, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the commitment they made to each other, the family they chose to create. In the years that followed, the Hartwell ranch prospered. Thomas, Elu, and Kaya worked side by side, building something that none of them could have built alone. Children came eventually, a blend of cultures that grew up speaking 3 languages and learning both Apache and frontier ways. The nearest town eventually learned of the unusual arrangement, but by then, the Hartwells were too well established and too well respected for anyone to cause trouble. Thomas lived another 40 years, surrounded by the family that had grown from that frozen morning when he found 2 sisters dying in the snow. On his deathbed, holding the hands of his wives who had never left his side, he whispered his gratitude for the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. The story passed into local legend, told around campfires and in saloons, growing more elaborate with each retelling. But the truth was simpler than any legend. A lonely man had found 2 lost women, and in saving them, he had saved himself. Love, they had all learned, was not something to be measured or contained by the expectations of others. It was as wild and boundless as the Colorado mountains, and just as beautiful.